I had the pleasure of recently speaking with Naveed Tariq, CEO at Seagrass, and Ely Sandler, a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government at the Seagrass launch event in Dubai during COP. In our conversation, we delved into the launch of Seagrass, an innovative marketplace in carbon markets based out of Abu Dhabi. Additionally, Ely shared insights from his recent paper on facilitating the energy transition through blended finance. We explored how developed states can strategically invest in clean energy infrastructure in the developing world, earning credit towards their emission targets whilst de-risking private finance and leveraging Article 6 under the Paris Agreement. It's an enlightening discussion, and I'm thrilled to share it with you on this episode. Welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project. Naveed, Ely, it's a pleasure to see you guys. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you for inviting us.
And welcome to the hoopla that is COP. I'm really excited to talk to you both today to learn a little bit more about the really interesting work that you guys are doing. Naveed, maybe I start with you. So you're the CEO of Seagrass, and I'd love to get a little bit of an update or just background around the initiative itself. You're recently announcing. Floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, so Seagrass is a subsidiary of E.ON. E.ON is a German energy company. And we were doing a lot of stuff in this energy company around decarbonization of the energy sector. And we invest in decarbonization of our infrastructure and connecting all the renewable assets around Europe. And part of this is also managing complex infrastructure across Europe requires you to do a lot of digitalization of this infrastructure as well. So in addition to digitalization and decarbonization, when we started to look into the carbon markets, we came to the conclusion that there are a lot of strengths that we have as operating a large system in Europe that lend themselves to the carbon market in a good way. And then we came to a point that instead of doing this as a department within a company, how about we create a company where we can bring those expertise and also the tools that we use and also the experience that we had and launch a company that can actually scale the carbon markets and transform the carbon finance.
Right. Okay. And then I guess leverage also your client network as well.
When it comes to our client network, it is something that is based on what E.ON would like to do and how they manage their clients. But what we can as a Seagrass leverage is E.ON's maybe relationships in Europe or with the customers. But more than that, we are an independent company, a subsidiary fully owned and fully localized under the ADGM and FSRA law in Abu Dhabi in UAE. And E.ON is hopefully going to be one of our customers, and we have to bring ourselves up to a quality standard that E.ON can work with us.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. So Ely, if I could turn to you. So you're working with Seagrass and you're announcing a paper today on Article 6. Can I explore that with you and learn a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So my day job is I'm a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School at the Belfer Center. So researching and teaching on climate finance, international policy. And fundamentally, we have these things called carbon markets, carbon finance. This is what Naveed mentioned. In economist speak, this is monetizing the positive externalities of investment, or in English, being paid to reduce carbon emissions. And so the more we can make this market function well, or the more money there can be in it, the more carbon emissions we reduce, the more we lower the cost of capital for green growth in emerging markets, and the closer we get to meeting the agreement that was signed in Paris in 2015. And so about a year ago at COP27, along with my co-author Dan Schrag, who is a professor at Harvard and runs the Center for the Environment, we wrote a paper proposing a new way of dealing with this thing called Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. And I think people have probably been hearing a lot about Article 6 because it's one of the core areas of focus in COP28. And at its core, Article 6 is a way of saying everyone in the world, all the nations, all the signatories to the Paris Agreement, they have an emissions reductions goal. Now, in general, the emissions reductions goals of developed countries, the US, Europe, Japan, they're much, much more ambitious than those in the developing world. This is for a few reasons. First of all, their emissions are much higher. Second of all, they've contributed a lot more to historical emissions. And third, it's right that we allow developing countries to take advantage of industrialization so they can develop. So what Article 6 does is it says that if a developed nation wants to meet part of its emissions reductions goal by financing clean infrastructure in an emerging market, it creates a win-win-win. The developed country gets to meet an ambitious carbon goal while safeguarding energy security and energy affordability at home. The developing country gets access to cheap capital. And when you're actually building this term carbon mitigation, that's actually infrastructure. That's transmission infrastructure, that's new energy, that's electrification, it's things to help countries grow. And then the third win is for the planet. Overall, we reduce emissions. And so my co-author Dan and I, we wrote a new paper creating a model of Article 6 that we hope could bring really large-scale investment, hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars, via this mechanism that we agreed in 2015 in Paris. Now, since then, a lot of things have developed, a lot of progress has been made, and what we're releasing, or what we released with Seagrass, is a report that channels this idea of Article 6 investment that Dan and I created and proposed last year at COP27. It channels it towards one of the hardest things to finance that we have in the energy transition.
And what's that?
That's grid infrastructure. That's transmission line, that's distribution, that's how you get the power from a renewable energy facility, which largely speaking are now actually economically viable if all the other factors work out, to homes that need it. And so what Seagrass released is a new methodology that says we can figure out how to, in the language of economists, monetize positive externalities, i.e. pay for reducing emissions for grids in emerging markets. And our case study is in Rwanda. And that's what we're releasing on Friday. And we have an event with the Rwandan government at COP28 saying this could be a way that governments can access large-scale financing in developing countries to build out their grids.
That's fantastic. And we touched on the economist speak and the pricing and externalities in carbon markets, which is quite esoteric. A lot of the time we speak sort of inside baseball. So thank you for quantifying that and qualifying that with sort of regular speak, let's just say. But so, I mean, very interesting that you mentioned the infrastructure is very obviously prescient, but it's very intensive with regards to the capital investments there. I'm curious as to how you envisage those to be financed. Is that through long-term offtakes on the Article 6 side between countries, or is it through debt markets? What's the sort of approach there with regards to the financing?
So you're completely right that the volume of infrastructure we need to build to meet anything like the projections for what it'll take to stay on course for the Paris Agreement is massive. There are a lot of different estimates from $4 trillion a year by 2030 to $6 trillion a year. We know it's a lot of money. And different components of the energy system are going to be financed in different ways. So the simplest thing, renewable energy generation, solar fields, hydro plants, wind farms. Actually, the model of how we finance those is quite simple. You build a piece of infrastructure, you generate some electricity, you sell it to someone, that pays back your initial investment.
So that's through the PPA?
That's through a PPA, a power purchase agreement, where you know you're going to sell an amount of electricity for a certain price. This is what people call bankable. You know exactly how much revenue you're going to get, and you have to deal with things like political risk, operational risk, but fundamentally the financial model makes sense. Now, what we're moving to is a problem where actually it's a lot of different parts of the energy system that really need smart policy innovation, and what they need is subsidization. They need public money to make these investments work for the private sector. And what we've been focusing on is grids. So grids at the moment, it's very, very different between advanced economies, developing countries, but fundamentally a grid does not make a lot of money. It's not generating electricity.
But it's an essential asset.
But so this is the problem. Exactly. It's completely essential to the energy transition, but it doesn't have an obvious source of revenue, and it doesn't have an obvious carbon emissions reduction gain. When you build a grid, nothing happens in the world. What it means is that in the future, you can build another hydro plant, or a previous solar plant can offload more electricity. But that infrastructure itself, it doesn't push out electrons onto the grid that would otherwise be pushed onto the grid by fossil fuels.
But it's essential to help scaling that delivery of the energy that ultimately then gets loaded onto the grid, correct?
Precisely. And so the thing that we've done, and the reason we need a new methodology, is to link this massive investment in grids. I think the IEA, the International Energy Agency, thinks it's about $830 billion by 2030. It's the amount of annual investment we need. Our methodology links that investment to the emissions reductions that infrastructure enables. And the way we think about that is in cost of capital. So the problem with grids is they're very expensive to build, they require a lot of capital, and the returns aren't obvious. In some countries, you get paid for electricity flowing along the grid, in some you don't. And so we're creating a new source of you can think of it as revenue, you can think of it as return for whoever is building the grid that will eventually enable generation infrastructure to come online.
Okay. And then the currency here, the hard currency in terms of, in addition to the revenue stream coming in from the sale of the electrons, the energy, is the carbon revenue. Am I correct? Is this under Article 6?
Yeah, so Article 6.
So these are 6.2 transactions or 6.4 transactions?
So
6.2, I would imagine.
The paper is structured along the lines of something called Article 6.2. Now, taking a step back, Article 6 agreed in 2015 at Paris. And I'm simplifying really, really broadly, but
it's fantastic for the audience.
As simple as I can. There's two really important bits of Article 6 that are going to come up a lot when people are reading about COP, 6.2 and 6.4. Originally, 6.4 was the marketplace for where the carbon credit got traded, kind of like eBay for carbon credits.
Sure.
Someone lists a credit, someone buys it. 6.2 was the accounting mechanism for once you bought and sold, how do you literally transfer that emission reduction from one account to another? Now, 6.4 was supposed to be the central mechanism, eBay for carbon credits, that was set up by the UNFCCC, probably going to be called the Sustainable Development Mechanism, builds on something from the Kyoto Protocols before. That's taken a very long time. But we need to get moving. We need more money flowing under this mechanism. So over the last 3-4 years, people have realized that actually Article 6.2, which is originally the accounting mechanism, can be used to finance large-scale projects on a bilateral basis. So one investor in one country in another country.
Okay.
And so our methodology takes advantage of this flexibility to say, actually, if there's a project we want to finance today, we don't want to wait for Article 6.4. We want to structure under Article 6.2 mechanism a way to transfer emissions reductions from a host country to a financing country in exchange for financing. So your question directly was...
So it's ICMOs that essentially are being
transferred. It's ICMOs that are being transferred, but your question was, is this revenue? And that's one of the other innovations of this, this piece we've come out with, and it's one of the innovations that we tried to put forward in the piece we released at COP27 from Harvard, is revenue is a really good way to get a biogas project financed. It's a really good way to get a cook stove project financed. It means you know there's going to be revenue, you can bank on that, someone's going to give you a loan against it. But when we're talking about projects in the hundreds of millions or the billions...
This is infrastructure finance.
And infrastructure finance, you don't want revenue in 5 years, you want upfront capital.
Yeah.
And so what we've been suggesting is that instead of being a way to buy and sell credits revenue after a project is built, which creates this catch-22 where you know you have revenue in future, but you need the upfront capital.
Yeah.
We should be using Article 6.2 as a mechanism for delivering upfront concessional financing to projects today, so that in the future they can generate emissions reduction.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that, Eli. That's a masterclass on Article 6. So thank you for making that essentially digestible for a wider audience. So thank you. Naveed, if I can just turn to you. So understanding now that that's the concessional finance piece, what is Seagrass's role within that? You know, Eli, and you mentioned the methodology aspect, but there's also a marketplace component, no? So I'd just like to understand that more succinctly, if you can.
So yeah, this was the thing that I mentioned in the beginning, and it was about scale. So what we want to do is make sure that this market scales, and what the work that we are doing with Ely is one of the ways that we can scale the carbon markets.
Yeah.
This is the thing that will accelerate and scale the carbon market. Without that, we feel there are a lot of like blockages, or there's a lot of barriers for this market to grow. So one of the promise that we are delivering with this framework is to scale the carbon market with partners such as banks, such as development banks, such as the government relationship that we can build over time and that we are already working with at the moment. So once you are building this structured transaction between the countries and the banks and the investments, and also the indices needs to be adjusted and all of that, eventually the transaction needs to take place on a certain venue, on a certain settlement has to happen somehow. And for that, we are thinking about how it can happen in a way that there is a regulations around it, there is a transparency around it, rather than simply having it over the emails and contracts, things like this. So we have launched also, while we speak as of today, marketplace, a Seagrass marketplace in partnership with one of our partners called ACX. Through this marketplace, we'll be able to do transactions not only in the voluntary market space, but we are looking into how to do also Article 6 market transactions as well. Because when it comes down to transfer of money, risks, and transfer of credits, we need a proper clearinghouse, you need a proper infrastructure that can support all of these transactions. And also it needs transparency of some sort, because this is what market sometimes is lacking, is people not talking about what they're doing, or people are not, or there is not enough transparency around what exactly is exchanging hands.
Sure, the price discovery is certainly a key issue, and this is why central pools of liquidity provided by exchanges are critical to provide that confidence and that transparency in the market.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I'm curious. Obviously, you mentioned in passing here the partnership with ACX. I talked to Wei Mei Hoon recently in Singapore, and obviously they made the announcement that not only providing the technology solutions for obviously their own exchanges in Abu Dhabi and Singapore, but also to IDX Carbon in Indonesia, and then the ATHEX exchange in Greece. And obviously now with this partnership with you, that's fantastic in terms of a broader reach. Just curious, and perhaps this is also inside baseball, so I apologize in advance, but is ACX providing the technology for the matching engine effectively and settlement facilities?
Exactly. So the way the Seagrass is structured is around customers. If I have to explain the relationship, ACX provides the software infrastructure, which is regulated and which we like. It is structured around the product itself, which is a product of carbon credit. But Seagrass is structured around the customer. So we do the whole carbon life cycle, from the assurance of the actual supply that we're going to work on, structuring of the transaction, where the price discovery can happen between the buyers, the sellers, or if it is a complex transaction like Article 6. And then later on, settlement venue. That's where we need to use a software like the ACX provides us. So yeah, so once the trade is settled on a platform, we also go beyond when it comes to making sure that the investors have a view on what is happening with the projects or their investment, how the project that they invested in is creating an impact. So just taking a simple example, it could be a trees or some forest or a mangrove that they have invested in. If you take that example, we use some digital maps, remote sensing. We work with local communities who provide us on-land data as well as the satellite data. And we create a massive amount of data sets around that project and make it available to buyers or the people who have already bought it and have their portfolio, that they can see around the world how their money is performing for each ton of the CO2 that they promised to remove. And that is, I think, very important as well.
No, that is very important. I talked to Marcelo Labre from Viridios AI, also Sam Gill from Silvera, and Diego Saz Gill from Pachama. And it seems like they're all leveraging these types of technologies, remote sensing, LiDAR, and other forms of IoT and other forms to provide more granularity and information about the quality of those projects. In the view of Silvera, obviously, and B0 and Calyx, they're providing opinions with regards to the ratings, right? And with the case of Viridios and Pachama, essentially more of the underlying data set. What it provides is essentially better decision-making ability for the buyers of these instruments. And so that's great. And the fact that you're adding that as an additional value baked into the exchange is a really interesting point of differentiation. So I'm also curious, sort of coming back to what Ely was mentioning, under these Article 6 transactions as a result of the concessional finance, is it safe to assume that obviously you've got bilateral relationships structured on an MOU basis between country A, country B, and then effectively the finance being deployed, now you've got the grid, and eventually you start getting the transfer of these ITMOs. Is it fair to assume, or maybe this is just a question, apologies, Naveed, is on the exchange side, who are the participants on the exchange? I would imagine obviously private sector actors, primary market, project developers, intermediaries, and the whole secondary market participants. But is there space here for public sector actors, governments, to take delivery as well?
I think in future there is a space for it, and that's what we are gearing up for, right? Okay. Because we want to make sure that these transactions, even at a government-to-government level, should be as simple and easy to make as it is among the corporate buyers and sellers. And the reason being is the time. We do not have time for bureaucracy. We do not have time for negotiating contracts till the cows come home. We do not have time for that, right? 6 years to go.
I spent 15 years in that space and then building the infrastructure to ameliorate that.
Exactly.
The delivery versus payment, the KYC and AML, reduction of counterparty and credit risk. Exchanges provide all of these benefits, and they accelerate not only the velocity, but they also provide greater liquidity because of the concentration, the benefits with regards to price discovery. All of these things are instrumental to ensure the longevity of these markets so that we can actually price these externalities and drive the critical finance to where it's needed and makes most impact.
I bring always the discussion back to why we are doing what we are doing.
Yeah.
And we said that from the beginning, we are doing it to bring scale to the market. We are doing it to bring speed to the market. We want to transform this market from scale, speed, and the type of projects that we want to do, because we have really a time problem at the moment, 2030. So if we can bring tools that can benefit government bodies or government banks or any other participant in the market to transact faster, transact with a peace of mind, and also with some structured kind of frameworks that Ely is working on. And I think that's a win-win.
No, I think this is fantastic. So thank you.
Yeah, I want to add, when we delve into what Naveed is talking about in terms of scale. So I think I mentioned before the rough sizing, there's a lot of different estimates of the climate finance gap. It's probably about $4.5 trillion a year by 2030. We have about $1.5 trillion of clean energy investment. We need a lot of different estimates, about $6 trillion. So $4.5 trillion a year is missing of investment. Now, the last 2 years, 3 years have seen what a lot of people have called phenomenal growth in voluntary carbon markets. And actually, it's one of the buzzwords that you hear around COP28. Voluntary carbon markets, off damage, these are the things people are talking about. The total size of this market is $2 billion.
Yeah.
That represents about...
Slightly larger in 21, slightly less in 23.
That represents maybe $300 or $400 million of what people call primary issuance.
No, it's a drop.
That's new money going into projects. So at the moment, out of the $4.5 trillion per year of investment we're missing, voluntary carbon markets provide a few hundred million, a tiny sliver of 1%.
Completely agree.
And so when I think about, from a public policy perspective, do we want carbon markets to be one of the things we can rely on, along with multinational development banks, along with government financing, along with carbon pricing? If we want carbon finance to be one of the levers governments can pull to reach climate goals, something has to radically shift, orders of magnitude radically. And so
3 orders of magnitude.
It's really crazy to me. And so one of the many things that needs to shift in our mind is a move from thinking about this just as a commodity you buy and sell, a carbon market, to being a form of investment. So if you look at the amount a government or the amount a private company can catalyze, use from its loan book, it's much, much, much bigger than the amount of credits they can buy with cash.
No doubt.
And so your question about who is going to be involved either in Seagrass's platform or anything else in these transactions, I think it's critical to move carbon markets from being $300 or $400 billion, $1 million, what we would call a commodity market, a thing that gets bought and sold, to being a tranche of the financial stack, the capital stack of large-scale infrastructure projects.
Great. And I think that comparison effectively, I've defined a corollary essentially here. When you look at credit markets, compare that to commodity markets, you see these order of magnitude step change. And so I think that you're absolutely right. And I think that the way you've structured it, if I can just interject here, is essentially, it's a glove in hand. You effectively, putting up the process via which concessional finance can actually be deployed at scale, right? Through debt, through these investments at a concessional finance level, the leveraging the multilateral banks, institutional finance, et cetera. And then it yields the outcomes with regards to the carbon component. So it's putting the horse in front of the cart effectively. So I really like that. So thank you for that. The question occurs to me. So Naveed, I'm going to ask you this one to you. Ely mentioned technologies, and methodologies around the grid. I'm curious as to what other technologies also need financing.
So if you look at what the purpose of Article 6 or the carbon market is, to finance those technologies that in the beginning are not financeable, but also from a perspective of that something that is right now cannot be financed because either it is happening in a country or a place where there is the risks are quite high, or the technology curve in terms of its cost structures are quite high. So it provides that additionality, because at the end of the day, this technology will eventually reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, correct? Now, when we look at with this principle, we saw some years back, these carbon markets helped the renewable sector quite a bit to kickstart. And when I look at the horizon in front of us, I see hydrogen. It's one technology which has a lot of promise. It has a lot of what you call it, an opportunity to reduce greenhouse gas emissions when it comes to its applicability around the world in different sectors. However, it is really at the nascent stage, and it is really not in the bank in many parts of the world or in many projects. So I believe if we do bring that into the fold with Article 6, there are some good opportunities here.
Yeah, and I think that absolutely right. I've spoken to a number of infrastructure providers and developers, and even academics who are working on this problem of scaling hydrogen technology. It is as you said, in its infancy. It's not nascent per se, but it's in its infancy, and it requires a lot of capital in order to deploy. But there's huge potential because essentially you also have decentralization, which aids in the grid component itself. So that's great. So Eli, I mean, that what Naveed just mentioned is very, very interesting with regards to these new technologies, especially on the hydrogen. Anything you want to add?
I think taking a step back, there's two really prominent narratives that come out in places like COP28, which from a theoretical economics 101 basis should be completely mutually incompatible. One is that you have a whole bunch of projects and a whole bunch of emerging markets saying something I said earlier in this interview, which is that the cost of capital is too high for them to attract financing and build renewable energy or green infrastructure. That's on one side. The other side, you have development banks, impact investors saying they can't find enough projects to invest in. That development banks, World Bank, National Development Banks, African Development Bank, they're competing with each other over the same projects. And theoretically, these two things should not both be true. There's both too many and too few projects and too much and too little capital. And so the crux of this is what people call bankability. It's having a project that investors view, even with a variable level of return for the risk, is bankable. And so what Naveed said is absolutely true, which is that a main advantage of Article 6 or of any carbon finance instrument, or actually of any public subsidization, is to bridge that gap between a project being bankable and not bankable. That can be by providing a first loss tranche of debt. That can be providing a new income stream. That can be providing a guarantee on something like a PPA. A lot of different problems, a lot of different ways to structure a public policy intervention that makes a project bankable. So specifically then thinking about where should we use these instruments? Where should we deploy this type of public policy? I think Naveed is absolutely right that there was a time when what we needed was to make renewables economically viable. We've moved on to that to now we're talking about grids, we're talking about off-grid renewables. And when Naveed mentions hydrogen, I think this fits into a similar point, which is that when we say hydrogen or we say renewable electricity, often we don't view the system together as a whole. So actually making hydrogen itself is really not the problem. The problem is not the electrolyzer to make the molecule of hydrogen. Often it's the transportation, it's the storage.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing for electricity. Making electricity is cheap, solar panels are cheap. Storing it, batteries, expensive. Building transmission lines, hard, costly. And so I think—
And there's losses as well in the transmission lines.
And so then it makes the efficiency of your generation infrastructure worse, and it makes the project economically unviable. And so I think I would go even broader than what Naveed is saying when he talks about hydrogen or he talks about other forms of ammonia or whatever it is what in project developer speak we call midstream. It's basically saying we pretty much know how to develop energy, we pretty much know how to use it. That'll be something like an electric car. And it's getting the energy, be it a green molecule or a green electron, if you want to use that phrase, from the generation to the user. That's the bit that we really need to use subsidization for. So that could be storage and distribution of hydrogen. That could be storage and distribution of electricity. It could be any of the many things for technologies we haven't even come up with yet. But it's building out the infrastructure that enables clean power to connect with the use of that power.
Yeah, and that storage component, I think that's really the huge potential of hydrogen, whether stored as ammonia or otherwise, because it can be on demand effectively, right? You're just harnessing the chemical energy effectively of its storage. You also can, as you mentioned, then the transportation, that's another key component, because in the energy markets today, when we look at it, okay, let's separate the electrons, but now let's look at hydrocarbons. We're in the UAE. there's quite a significant quotient, let's just say, of hydrocarbons in this state. But essentially, the energy density of those hydrocarbons allows for transport, right? But hydrogen also does as well, right? And so now you can store it, but you could transport it from energy-rich states essentially to those that are maybe not as well. Would you care to elaborate on that?
I would say the opposite. I think that actually, the energy density of hydrogen is terrible from a transportation and storage point of view. So, like, what the reason fossil fuels have dominated the world since the Industrial Revolution is because they are extremely energy dense, and something like oil and coal is very easy to transport.
Sure. Subject to volume as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then that came about with gas through LNG. That is not the case with hydrogen, and that's why we need public subsidies. If hydrogen was energy dense and easy to transport, we would have loads of hydrogen and we wouldn't need to subsidize it. Actually, we have a technical problem that needs a policy solution. That hydrogen is not a good molecule to get from point A to point B.
Right.
I mean, it's the smallest molecule. So whatever you store in it.
Sure. As a gas, but what about as ammonia? I mean, certainly transportation of hydrogen gas is not what I was alluding to compared to LFG. I mean, the tankers
people, I think, many people know much more about this than me and Naveed. So I'm telling you what I've heard from other people that are smarter than us. But I think every time you transform an energy source, you lose 20, 30, 40% of it. And so if we want to transport energy as ammonia, you have to make hydrogen where you lose energy. You have to transmit the hydrogen into ammonia where you lose energy, transport it. You're then probably not using ammonia, you're probably using it in another form again. And so every time you transform the energy, you make losses. And that's why this whole process needs public policy support.
Okay. And that's where I think the Article 6, that the work that we are doing could be quite helpful.
Yeah, so do you want to unpack that for me, Naveed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so at the end of the day, when you need to scale or when you need to achieve scale, you need to pull all the levers, everything, everywhere, all at once, right? United Nations General Secretary said that, and I truly believe that. So I want to be fully inclusive of everything that can be done, but also we will need to be innovative about it. So this piece of work that we have done and other digitalization things that we're going to be doing around the maps to create trust and transparency and integrity around the market, creating a platform where the transaction can happen faster around it and the counterparty risk can be managed, having a team of people who help the parties to discover price and come up to the levels of cost and price that are acceptable to all the parties. All of these work, the customer centricity or life cycle of carbon, simply we say carbon for everything that we're doing, but it's all about how to bring about the sustainability, how to meet those Paris Agreement goals for the 1.5. So yeah, I think our work is about that, our partnership is about that, and we will continue to do and work on this.
Fantastic. I think that's great. Thank you so much for your time, boys.
Great.
It's fantastic. Thank you.